They tried to pretend I was never part of the story. The first sign was subtle, an invitation removed from a calendar I had personally created. Then my access to the proposal drafts disappeared, replaced by an error message that suggested the file no longer existed. I had built the foundation of the $3.2 million deal, yet every trace of my involvement was being erased. At first, I assumed it was a technical hiccup, an IT glitch, a mistaken permission update. But when my badge blinked red at the entrance and the security guard avoided eye contact, the intention became clear. I was being escorted out of a project I had spent 8 months shaping, brick by brick, while others rehearsed speeches they hadn't earned. I wasn't hired for charm. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room. My strength was preparation, research, numbers, and logic. When a market seemed unpredictable, I discovered an overlooked demand segment. When suppliers stalled negotiations, I redesigned the logistics model to guarantee margins. Investors didn't trust the dream. They trusted the map I drew for them. I never needed applause. I needed precision. That was my contribution, and it made the entire board dependent on me. They forgot dependence breeds jealousy. Some men fear excellence not because it threatens them today, but because it could replace them tomorrow. That fear whispers in corridors before it becomes policy. 2 weeks before the final signing, the tone shifted. Board members who once sought my expertise began speaking over me during meetings. A junior executive forwarded a report I had drafted, claiming it was a collective effort. The CFO, a man who couldn't differentiate between net margin and gross cost, started hinting at leadership consolidation. I didn't react. People reveal intentions when they believe you can't stop them. Their confidence grew with every silent nod I gave, and silence, in corporate warfare, is the most deceptive weapon. It convinces insecure men they've already won. The morning the board gathered for the decisive briefing, every chair had a nameplate except mine. My documents had been reprinted, my contributions removed, my diagrams replaced, my models presented as if they belonged to others. They didn't bother to hide their ambition. To them, I was an inconvenience, a staircase they climbed and now wanted to demolish. They believed that removing my presence removed my influence. They forgot creation leaves fingerprints. Even ghosts leave shadows. The worst betrayal wasn't professional, it was personal. A man I once coached through his first investor pitch avoided my gaze. The marketing director, who used to praise my diligence, flattered the COO with rehearsed enthusiasm. Everyone played a role in this silent expulsion, as if denying my existence protected their future. They wanted a story without its author. They wanted headlines without the hands that typed them. They mistook competence for servitude. They misunderstood contribution as obedience. That was their first mistake. My phone stopped receiving internal messages. The access card I used daily was deactivated without notice. Even the receptionist avoided saying hello, as though acknowledging me might implicate her. It was a coordinated erasure, swift, calculated, confident. They celebrated prematurely, unaware that every erased signature was a legal thread leading back to them. Their excitement blinded them to one universal rule. Power built on stolen work is never stable. It cracks under scrutiny. They thought sidelining me removed risk. Instead, it removed protection. I watched them congratulate each other, oblivious to the details they had overlooked, details only I knew. They assumed silence meant apathy. They assumed absence meant defeat. What they failed to understand was that I wasn't disappearing. I was documenting. I was waiting. And while they rehearsed their speeches, I prepared something far more dangerous than revenge. I prepared the truth. They erased me from the deal. They didn't know I was the part they couldn't delete. Their downfall didn't begin with a mistake. It began with a decision rooted in arrogance. The COO, a man who had memorized leadership cliches but never led anything successfully, believed the merger would finally crown him as the visionary he pretended to be. The CFO, who treated financial reports like lottery tickets, was promised a performance bonus if he delivered the deal before the quarter ended. The board, hungry for media attention, imagined headlines praising their strategic genius. In their minds, I was a threat, not because I opposed them, but because my work exposed the gap between their ambition and their ability. They didn't want competence. They wanted applause. The COO initiated the purge. He called a private meeting with selected executives and delivered instructions in a tone that imitated leadership yet dripped with insecurity. He demanded that all materials be revised, removing any reference that suggested the deal originated from my research. The legal officer looked uneasy, aware that credit reassignment wasn't just unethical, it was risky. But the COO silenced objections with promises of promotions and vague warnings about team loyalty. The room complied. Fear disguised itself as agreement. From that moment, emails transformed into weapons. My drafts were forwarded without my name, my calculations presented as collective insights, and my strategic recommendations reshaped into hollow bullet points. The CFO, eager to secure his bonus, began telling investors he had personally discovered the supply chain opportunity that I had spent weeks refining. He practiced lines before meetings, rehearsing humility so he could appear modest when praised. The board believed every word, not because it was credible, but because it aligned with their desire to be celebrated before the ink dried. Meanwhile, I became invisible in the documentation. Slides were modified. Contracts were updated. Even internal memos replaced my initials with generic phrases like "the team concluded" or "the department identified." These alterations weren't accidental. They were systematic. Each change served a single purpose: eliminate the one person who could prove the narrative was a lie. They assumed visibility controlled reality. They never considered that digital footprints don't vanish simply because someone pretends they weren't there. What they failed to notice was that every action created evidence. Every request I received, every version I edited, every change they ordered was stored, time-stamped, and traceable. While they toasted future praise, I archived files. While they rehearsed compliments for investors, I gathered correspondence. I didn't raise alarms. I didn't confront anyone. I understood something they didn't. Arrogance doesn't destroy reputations overnight. Arrogance builds the rope, ties the knot, then proudly places its head inside. Their confidence grew as the signing date approached. The COO ordered branded notebooks for the ceremony. The CFO booked photographers. The board president drafted a speech celebrating strategic leadership. They considered themselves pioneers, unaware that pioneers leave trails. Every signature they forged onto my contributions, every misattributed idea, every altered slide became a legal breadcrumb leading directly to them. In their obsession with praise, they forgot the simplest corporate truth: systems remember. The cracks began to appear when an outside analyst requested clarifications about figures I had crafted. The CFO stumbled through explanations, confusing timelines and suppliers. Instead of reconsidering their strategy, the board doubled down, assuming confidence could replace competence. Their egos refused revision. They weren't building a deal. They were building a stage. Unfortunately for them, stages collapse when the foundation is fiction. By the time they realized documentation outranks storytelling, the structure of their deception was already complete. In trying to erase my presence, they unintentionally highlighted it. Every missing reference raised questions. Every modified report demanded scrutiny. Every inconsistency pointed to motive. The more they tried to hide me, the more indispensable I became. History doesn't disappear when ignored. It hardens. What they erased wasn't my name. It was their credibility. They didn't just write me out of the deal. They wrote themselves into the investigation. The deal wasn't a purchase. It was an ecosystem. The board saw $3.2 million on paper and assumed the investors were paying for assets, equipment, and projected revenue. They didn't realize the machinery was secondary. What convinced the investors wasn't the factory size, the infrastructure, or the brand recognition. It was the operational model I had engineered from the ground up, a model that stitched together suppliers, logistics providers, distribution networks, and market triggers in a way that guaranteed profitability regardless of economic fluctuations. They celebrated the visible parts of the deal while remaining blind to the architecture holding it together. Months before the first meeting, I had traveled across borders to find producers capable of meeting our volume demands without compromising quality. One supplier in Senegal hesitated to commit until I restructured payment terms that protected him from currency instability. Another in Portugal demanded exclusivity, which I negotiated down to regional priority. A third partner in Morocco insisted on a clause guaranteeing raw material access, forcing me to redesign storage contingencies. Each agreement required precision. Every signature represented weeks of trust-building conversations. None of these relationships existed before I initiated them. None could survive without someone who understood the rationale behind each commitment. The board believed contracts were checkboxes, as those signatures magically enforced loyalty. They had never seen what happens when a single clause is misunderstood. They didn't realize that one missed delivery could collapse margin projections, trigger penalty clauses, and destroy investor confidence. I had planned buffers, alternative suppliers, and legal mechanisms that prevented bottlenecks, fraud, and sabotage. They saw lines on paper. I saw a web of interdependencies that required synchronized execution. To them, the deal looked straightforward. To me, it was a machine with hundreds of moving parts, each dependent on the others. The investors appreciated complexity. That was why they wanted us. They weren't buying a company. They were buying stability. During negotiations, I presented cost variation tables, shipment forecasts, and scenario-based revenue maps. I incorporated seasonal risks, transportation delays, and supply chain disruptions into the pricing model. It was this depth that reassured them. But once the board removed me, they assumed the numbers would speak for themselves. Numbers don't speak. They need translators. Without context, figures are just digits with optimism attached. Things began to unravel the moment they tried to address investor concerns without me. A simple inquiry about delivery obligations led to contradictory answers. The COO promised a timeline that contradicted maritime schedules. The CFO cited profit margins that didn't factor insurance differentials. The board chairman claimed market dominance in territories we had not yet secured. They mistook confidence for competence. Investors don't trust enthusiasm. They trust structure. With every inaccurate response, doubt seeped into the room. The true catastrophe emerged when they attempted to modify a clause I had deliberately engineered to protect us. It was a conditional trigger tied to supplier performance. If removed, suppliers could legally prioritize competitors. The board mislabeled it as optional, unaware it was the backbone of the leverage that allowed us to command pricing power. Investors noticed the oversight immediately. Their questions shifted from opportunity to risk. The board, unprepared, offered explanations so shallow they exposed their ignorance. Arrogance doesn't just weaken strategy, it highlights inadequacy. The tragedy wasn't that they excluded me. The tragedy was that they believed the deal was self-sustaining. They confused structure with decoration, mistaking complexity for exaggeration. They didn't understand what they had acquired, nor the expertise required to maintain it. Deals don't succeed because numbers add up. They succeed because someone understands how the pieces stay together. They try to fly a plane without knowing where the wings were attached. The moment they removed the architect, they removed the oxygen. The deal didn't suffocate because I left. It suffocated because they thought it could breathe without lungs. The easiest battles are the ones your enemies don't know they're fighting. After they erased me from the deal, I resisted every instinct to confront them. No late-night emails demanding explanations. No meetings to defend my work. No dramatic walkouts. Silence became my strategy, not because I lacked words, but because I understood timing. In corporate environments, noise creates enemies. Silence creates certainty. I allowed their confidence to grow unchecked, knowing that uncontrolled ego always outpaces ability. They mistook my quietness for surrender, not realizing it was preparation. From a distance, I observed everything. The COO strutted around the office rehearsing his acceptance speech as if awards were already engraved with his name. The CFO bragged to anyone who would listen about the visionary financial structure he claimed to have designed. Departments buzzed with speculation about promotions, title changes, and corner offices. People love stories, and they had written one where I no longer existed. My absence wasn't suspicious, It was convenient. They wanted me gone, so they believed I had accepted defeat. Their blindness was not accidental. It was self-inflicted. Meanwhile, I monitored documents they assumed I couldn't access anymore. Schedules for the signing ceremony appeared in shared folders. Draft press releases circulated between board members. Someone had already contacted a journalist to reserve space for a celebratory interview. They were so eager to taste glory, they didn't bother checking if the meal was poisoned. Every step they took without caution brought them closer to consequences they couldn't anticipate. They believed victory was an event. I knew it was a trap. My silence amplified itself. Colleagues who once greeted me enthusiastically became uneasy around the absence of confrontation. One manager asked if everything was all right. I smiled, said nothing, and returned to my work. That smile, simple, unbothered, uninterested, disturbed them more than anger ever could. People fear calmness they don't understand. They expected rage. They expected accusations. They expected noise. Silence was unpredictable. Silence was calculation. Silence meant I wasn't finished. The board mistook their momentum for inevitability. They printed glossy binders showcasing their deal strategy. They ordered custom pins embossed with the company logo. They even reserved a banquet hall for an evening celebration. Champagne was purchased. A slideshow was commissioned. They behaved like travelers celebrating arrival before reaching their destination, unaware the bridge ahead was missing. I saw invoices and bookings they issued without hesitation. It fascinated me how easily hubris replaced caution. What none of them realized was that every action they took without my involvement increased the severity of their exposure. They had redesigned workflows, modified contracts, and made decisions without consulting the architect of the operation. It wasn't sabotage on my part. It was mathematics. Systems collapse when foundational pieces are removed. I didn't need to push. I only needed to watch. Each silent moment laid another brick in the wall they were building around themselves. Their rush for recognition prevented them from verifying contractual triggers, dependency clauses, and regulatory requirements, elements I had built into the plan specifically to prevent reckless shortcuts. They didn't see the safety mechanisms. They only saw the spotlight. They overestimated their competence and underestimated the cost of omission. Silence is a mirror. It reflects character better than confrontation. In mine, they saw nothing, so they assumed nothing existed. They celebrated unchecked, unaware that every cheer echoed closer to an unavoidable reckoning. Their arrogance wasn't merely growing, it was accumulating interest. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Silence was the fuse. They lit it themselves. The signing ceremony was not a meeting, it was a performance. The conference room had been transformed overnight into something grander than a business environment. Crystal bottles of imported water lined the polished table. Every chair bore a nameplate engraved in metal, not printed on paper. The CFO adjusted his tie repeatedly, unable to hide the satisfaction swelling inside him. He wasn't signing a deal, he was auditioning for greatness. Photographers set up tripods at angles designed to immortalize smiles that hadn't yet earned the moment they were meant to celebrate. It was a staged victory, and everyone behaved as if the outcome was inevitable. Executives entered like nobles at a royal gathering, exchanging handshakes and air kisses forged in mutual ambition rather than respect. The COO rehearsed facial expressions suited for interviews he expected later that evening. The board president whispered instructions to his assistant, ensuring press releases were ready to send the moment signatures hit paper. The atmosphere wasn't confident, it was euphoric. They believed history would remember them as the architects of a lucrative expansion, unaware history was already writing a different chapter in ink too permanent for revision. Investors arrived last. Their presence altered the room instantly, silencing casual chatter. The CFO greeted them with a grin that bordered on theatrical. He gestured to the contracts stacked neatly on the table, as if layers of paper represented triumph rather than dependency. Nobody questioned the pacing, the assumptions, or the missing pieces. They believed deals were finalized through paperwork. They forgot deals survive through understanding. I entered quietly, and stood near the back wall. No one acknowledged me. The COO's eyes slid past me, dismissing my presence as irrelevant. My calm expression irritated him. People expect those they betray to appear wounded. Indifference threatens narratives. I watched the room fill with self-congratulation, each attendee convinced they were moments away from corporate immortality. Not a single person considered the possibility that their victory required more than signatures. The chairman began the ceremonial speech, praising the team's ingenuity and dedication. He spoke of strategy, resilience, and market dominance, all words borrowed from presentations I had written. His voice resonated with conviction. Mine resonated nowhere, proving how thoroughly they believed they had replaced the architect of the deal. No one clapped for me. They didn't plan to. They didn't think they needed to. Finally, contracts were distributed. The CFO, with exaggerated poise, guided the investors through pages he barely understood. He emphasized projected revenue, strategic positioning, and synergies he couldn't define. Smiles widened. Pens uncapped. Everyone leaned forward, ready to etch their names into a future they did not comprehend. Page after page turned without hesitation. Heads nodded. No one paused to question the depth behind the numbers. Deals collapse, not because of lies, but because truths remain unread. Then came page 56. The lead attorney, a disciplined professional with an instinct for irregularity, lowered his voice and traced a finger along a section few ever notice. His eyes froze. His demeanor shifted. He leaned closer, reading again, slower this time. The room inhaled collectively, expecting another opportunity for applause. He cleared his throat instead, an action so small it fractured the performance. Clause 12.4. He murmured, each syllable slicing through anticipation. Applause died before it could be born. The CFO's confident posture wilted. The board members exchanged glances, struggling to decode the sudden shift. Investors straightened in their seats, sensing undisclosed gravity. Silence, thick and unanticipated, settled over the room. They had reached the moment where performance met reality. They turned the pages. They turned pale. Clause 12.4 had entered the room long before I did. Now, it demanded to be heard. Clause 12.4 was never intended to be decorative. It was the spine of the entire agreement, inserted long before anyone imagined it would be needed. During drafting sessions, executives waved it away, calling it redundant and overly cautious. The COO joked that only paranoid people added such provisions. The CFO dismissed it as legal poetry, something no one would ever read again. I insisted it remained. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify myself. I simply used the same calm tone that accompanies truths inevitable enough to become consequences. They agreed to avoid delays, unaware they had signed their own trap. On paper, the clause looked harmless, one sentence tucked at the bottom of a page few people ever reached. But legal documents don't measure lines. They measure ownership. Clause 12.4 didn't protect an idea. It protected the person who created the idea. It established that the operational model at the heart of the merger had an author, and that author possessed the veto power to invalidate the deal if excluded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a lock, and the key rested with the architect they tried to erase. The lead attorney adjusted his glasses and reread the text slowly, as though each word demanded respect. His voice dropped the room into stillness when he asked the question that shattered the illusion everyone had worked so hard to maintain. Who is the architect? 5 words, spoken without volume, detonated the ceremony. The board froze. The CFO's confident smile collapsed into confusion. The COO's complexion shifted from pride to panic. Investors leaned forward, suddenly interested in what they had prematurely considered a routine formality. A room filled with certainty transformed into a courtroom without warning. The silence that followed wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of truth. The executives could no longer pretend I was irrelevant. Clause 12.4 made irrelevance impossible. If the architect wasn't identified and acknowledged, the merger could not proceed. Without the architect's approval, every signature already on the page meant nothing. Millions of dollars, months of preparation, and reputations built on borrowed competence were now hanging by a single thread. The attorney scanned the faces of the board. He repeated the question, slower this time, as though addressing children rather than leaders. Who is the architect? The COO opened his mouth but produced nothing. The CFO fumbled through his documents, searching for a narrative that didn't exist. Their silence admitted guilt more effectively than any confession. They didn't forget me, they tried to bury me. The problem with burying architects is that foundations are made of stone, not soil. Heads turned, hands trembled, pulses accelerated. The room that minutes earlier overflowed with ambition now reeked of fear. The investors' expressions shifted from enthusiasm to scrutiny. They smelled negligence, perhaps fraud. They looked for someone capable of explaining how a legal clause of this magnitude had slipped past so many decision-makers. Their patience wasn't limitless. Their tolerance for incompetence was non-existent. Then, slowly, inevitably, every gaze found me. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I raised my chin slightly, acknowledging neither victory nor hostility. I wasn't there to celebrate humiliation. I was there to witness truth. The COO blinked rapidly, as though hoping I might disappear a second time. The CFO swallowed so hard his collar tightened around his neck. The chairman's voice cracked when he tried to speak. Power had shifted, not with noise, but with recognition. The attorney turned toward me, his expression neutral but curious. "Are you the architect?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Documentation doesn't lie. Metadata doesn't negotiate. History doesn't need permission to exist. I stepped forward, not dramatically, not triumphantly, simply enough for my presence to become undeniable. The room leaned toward me, suspended between dread and necessity. Their fate was no longer in their hands. The clause they ignored had become the only voice that mattered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Clause 12.4 had spoken for me. The moment Clause 12.4 landed on the table, the merger stopped breathing. Investors who moments earlier smiled politely now stared at the board with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. They weren't emotional, they were calculating. Deals collapsed not because of anger, but because of doubt, and doubt had just entered the room wearing a name and a legal anchor. The investors requested clarification, not paragraphs. They wanted a single answer. Who built the operational model? When the executives hesitated, the investors exchanged glances that said everything. No architect, no deal. A structure without an engineer is a monument to liability. The board panicked. Their first instinct wasn't to fix the problem. It was to control it. They ushered everyone out of the room and dragged me into a smaller office, suddenly remembering my existence with an enthusiasm that felt both artificial and late. Their eyes sparkled with desperation. The COO insisted that everything was a misunderstanding. The CFO added that I was always part of the team, as though history could be rewritten with flattery. They didn't apologize for erasure. They apologized for being caught. Their tone wasn't remorse, it was negotiation. Then came the offers. They dangled titles like trophies: Vice President of Strategy, Executive Director of Global Operations, Chief Architect of Innovation. They offered stock options, reserved parking, international trips, anything to make the problem evaporate. They pledged loyalty they couldn't spell and promised recognition they hadn't earned. Their proposals weren't designed to honor me. They were designed to salvage themselves. Every word they uttered exposed the truth. They would rather buy silence than admit wrongdoing. I said nothing. Silence doesn't negotiate. My quietness forced them to continue, to reveal more than they intended. The chairman stepped forward with a speech rehearsed in corporate panic. He blamed confusion, miscommunication, administrative oversight, anything but intent. He called me an essential pillar. He said the company needed my leadership. He never mentioned the emails removing me from meetings or the documents rewritten to exclude my contributions. He spoke as though sincerity could be manufactured. But sincerity without accountability is camouflage. Outside the room, time turned against them. Deadlines passed. Penalties activated. The investors issued notices demanding full disclosure of all architectural contributions. Contractual fines multiplied every hour the board failed to comply. Internal departments froze operations until legality was confirmed. Suppliers asked whether contracts were still valid. Rumors spread faster than memos. Employees who once whispered doubts now whispered names. Silence. Once my strategy became their curse. Then the evidence surfaced, not because I leaked it, but because neglect always leaves traces. Screenshots of messages where executives begged for my expertise appeared in archived servers. Drafts bearing my signature resurfaced in shared drives. Voice notes confirming my authorship re-emerged from cloud backups. The board's attempt to erase me didn't erase anything. It highlighted intent. Fraud isn't defined by failure. Fraud is defined by concealment, and they had documented their own. Auditors arrived with questions no one wanted to answer. They requested access logs, version histories, communication threads, proof that decisions were ethical. What they discovered wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate removal of the architect to claim personal glory. Corporate sabotage disguised as ambition. The price was no longer financial. It was reputational. Investors don't fear losses. They fear incompetence. The merger stood still, but consequences didn't. Interest accumulated. Penalties mounted. Trust evaporated. The leadership team, once obsessed with recognition, now struggled for relevance. No press release could disguise the truth. Recognition can be stolen. Credibility cannot. The executives learned a lesson older than business itself. Buildings don't collapse because walls crack. They collapse because foundations are missing. You cannot replace the architect once the blueprint is signed. You cannot rewrite history once it is time-stamped. You cannot erase a foundation without watching the structure fall. Their greed didn't cost them the deal. It cost them everything that made the deal worth having.